today. All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Susie Taylor. I'm part of the NEBP education team. I'm based at Montana State University, and it is my pleasure today to welcome you to the NEBP speaker series. Our presenter today is Dr. Doan-Crider. She is the Director of the Animo Partnership in Natural Resources. She's the PI of the Willow project at Salish Kootenai College, and she is the coordinator of the Native American Rangelands Partnership. We are very excited to have you with us here today. I'm also really excited to report that our speaker was recommended to us by one of the team members at the SKC ballooning team. So that tells all of you, if you have a recommendation for someone you'd like to see as part of our speaker series, please let us know. I'll put my email in the chat in just a moment here. And people have been very generous in sharing their time. We have folks from NASA and from STEM organizations all over the country who want to share what they do with you. And so if you have somebody you'd like us to invite, I think the odds are good that they will say yes. So definitely let us know if you have a suggestion for our speaker. Great. Well, Deanna, thank you so much for being here today. We will turn it over to you. And thanks again.
Awesome. What a treat. I'm all the way down here on the Texas-Mexico borderlands where things are exciting, both politically and everything else, but far away from Montana, which is where a lot of the people that I love live. I'm a Grizz. Apologies to my MSU folks. And anyway, went to the University of Montana a long time ago, and now it looks like we're going back. So my hope is that we'll be moving back to Montana in the next couple of years. So as you can see here, I do work with Salish Kootenai College. Wonderful place, wonderful people. I'm hoping that you all get to know each other during, this project. What a great project. So really glad to get pulled into this. So a little bit of my background is that I am an Indigenous woman, and I share my citizenship with both the United States and with Mexico. My mother's from Mexico. She was an immigrant, and she's an Indigenous person. My grandmother's side were Zacatecos, which are grassland people. Zacate in Nahuatl means grass. And then we're Tepehuanos on my grandfather's side, which means that we're from the mountains. And so you'll see this interesting pattern that I have in my life that I've kind of followed those tracks, my entire life. And both the Zacatecos and the Tepehuanes are Acorn people. And I really didn't realize this until I started growing into my profession. And I think I asked a bunch of you to watch just a really short video that I had called The Power of an Acorn. And that would give you a little bit of my family background and just telling my story about how I came to have a relationship with bears and with acorns. And acorns, believe it or not, in many ways are actually stronger than a bear. So I'm going to tell you that story today. So this talk is about how we can braid local knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, and I'll go ahead and talk about that in a little bit, but also using Western science. Those are very different perspectives, different approaches, but it is what it is, and we have all of those things. It's like two river currents coming together at the same time, and we have to learn how to navigate those currents to kind of respect culture, but at the same time, put these things to work together to make a really, really powerful tool for conservation and fixing this poor and ailing planet that we have today. Sorry, let me get this going. All right, so you saw in the video, Power of an Acorn, a little bit of my background. This is my grandfather, and he influenced me the most. I should mention, too, on my dad's side, because you're wondering why I'm so camouflaged. My dad's side is Irish and Scottish, and back in Ireland and Scotland, they're Indigenous on that side of the world, right? But my family from his side has been over in the United States since the 1800s. And my dad and my mother met in Mexico, and that's how I came about. Well, my grandfather used to tell me these incredible stories, and if you watch the video, you would know that he was a naturalist. He spent a lot of time in nature. He spent a lot of time in the mountains, and he's the one that influenced me, which is really interesting because in Mexico, we have a little bit of a reputation for being a bit machismo, but that's not what I found there. I actually had a lot of family support, even though I had a traditional family. They encouraged me to pursue my love of bears that I've had ever since I was a young girl. And my grandfather was very, very proud of me. And in the video, you'll see that I left Mexico to get an education and learned that pathway along with what I learned when I came back to Mexico to study bears there, and I've been studying bears there for about 30 years. I had a picture of St. Francis de Assisi on there, and one of the things that I wanted to mention about that was that St. Francis, actually, let me go back because you'll want to see this picture. It's really strange. But there was a poet called Rubén Darío, and he wrote this poem about St. Francis going up to talk to the wolf in the mountains because the wolf had been killing sheep. And so, of course, the people in Spain asked him to go, fix this. And so he went and talked to the wolf, and he told the wolf that he really shouldn't be killing the animals. And so he invited the wolf to live down with the humans for a while, and he went down there. And then a few months later, the wolf was back killing sheep again. And the wolf told him, look, I kill sheep because I have to eat. But the human beings, he said, even though I was living down there with you all and you all offered to feed me, he says, you guys kill each other for a lot of different reasons. And there were a lot of, there was a lot of greed and a lot of stealing. And anyway, he says, I wasn't too impressed. And so St. Francis knew that the wolf was right, and he bowed his head and he let the wolf go back to being a wolf because he was acknowledging that human beings had probably a few more vices than the wolves themselves. And my grandfather used to tell me that story, and it really engaged me with bears. And I learned a lot from bears about myself and about science and about human beings at the same time. So I started my education at University of Arizona. I was living with my dad. My mom passed away when I was young. So we had to stay in the United States for a number of other reasons. And I went to school at the University of Arizona and was taught in very Western ways in terms of how we study wildlife. And a lot of that means that we catch wildlife, we put radio collars on them, and we follow them around, and then we publish our information so that other scientists can build upon that. At Arizona, I realized if I'm going to study bears, I need to go to a place that has lots and lots of bears. So I went ahead and moved up to Montana, spent my time there back in the late 80s and early 90s, graduated, and then I moved back home to Mexico with my undergraduate. And then I went on to get my PhD, my master's and PhD at Texas A&M University. The reason I did that was because they had herbariums that were familiar with the plant life that we had there, and that was very important. So after I got my education with all of these wonderful schools, they kind of prepared me with this toolbox. It's like, okay, this is what you do in STEM science. This is how you're going to study wildlife. You're going to be objective. You don't want to get connected to the animals that you study. You certainly don't want to name them. And you're going to catch as many of them as you can. You're going to crawl into their dens and count how many cubs they have. And then you're going to produce these studies to, tell all about, these things that we know about these bear populations. And then you're going to publish about it. And then we're going to get more research money to study them even more. Okay, so that was my toolbox. And that's what I learned in school. So I went down to Mexico to do that. And anyway, learned a lot of things just once I got home and started talking to people and doing my background research. And it was very, very different than that in the United States. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the bears in Mexico, which is very, very different in the United States. And that's mainly because we were colonized by Spain versus the United States that was mainly colonized by other European countries, England and France and whatnot. So when all of those colonizers came to the United States, pretty much the effect was the same on any kind of a predator. And grizzly bears, of course, were just too problematic and too cumbersome for the kind of animals that these colonizers wanted to raise. So the grizzly bear was actually completely eradicated in Mexico by the 1960s, which was heartbreaking to me because my grandfather would tell me stories of seeing grizzly bears in the mountains when he worked on the railroad there. So I was all geared up. I'm going to go to Montana, learn how to study grizzly bears, come back to Mexico. And by the time I came back, they were gone. However, the black bear was headed in a very southwestern direction. They were headed downward. They were in a lot of trouble by the 80s. Their populations had diminished significantly, but I thought, you know what, that's what I'm going to focus on. We still have a chance to work on helping our black bears to recover. In Texas, they were completely eradicated by the 1940s, but in Mexico, we had some pockets of, believe it or not, we had livestock ranchers that were also really keyed into the environment and to nature, and they actually preserved these pockets of black bears in a number of different states in Mexico, and I landed in one of those places that I'll show you about in just a minute. Oops, went backwards, sorry. So I want to talk a little bit about things like distribution, okay? And this is really important to recognize that as we study science, particularly wildlife, our picture or our photograph of the literature that we rely on is very young. And we'll talk about indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in just a minute, but I want to emphasize the fact that those data, that knowledge is very old, very, very long-term, thousands of years of knowledge. However, the knowledge that we tend to rely on in Western science is that which is published in the literature, okay? So for example, for learning about bears in Mexico, the earliest that I could find was information published in the 1950s by a man named Starker Leopold, and many of us who study wildlife know that he's the son of who we call the father of Western wildlife management, and that's Aldo Leopold. And what was really interesting is that these people here that are listed, they went down to Mexico, and notice that there's no Mexicans on this. I want to emphasize the fact that most of the people that went down to do this research were from the United States. And so they went down, and then they got a few observations of bears, and guess what? This is the distribution map that they published. Said, okay, these are the distribution map for black bears. Well, in essence, that just meant that they had a big magic marker, right? Because it's really hard to determine the actual distribution of animals, especially when they were looking at such a small window. So they just basically got some locations and then drew a real big, colored picture around it. But what that did was that set up the rest of us who were going to be looking at bear populations in the future with these assumptions that that is where bears used to live. And that was just based on observations that they got in the 1950s. So let's talk about that for a minute. One of the problems that we have in Mexico is that we have a very poor fossil record. It's not very poor fossil record. It's just that we're not out there digging everything up and going on to people's, ranches and all kinds of stuff to look at this fossil record. We have a very poor fossil record for northern Mexico, most of which since colonization is private. So we just don't have access to it. Some of the things we refer to are like drawings and things like that, or, as you move further south in Mexico, a lot of the creative pictures that we see on pyramids and things like that. That's how we tell the stories about wildlife. But in northern Mexico, things were a lot different. And we had very few studies that were conducted prior to the 80s and even as far as the 50s. So really the assumptions that we made about, where we saw bears and what they were doing was all based on that very young data set. So that's really important. So again, many estimates on the historic range and numbers of black bears were based on very few observations, and again, dependent on the size of a magic marker. My big question is, what were bears doing before colonization, before they were persecuted, before they were chased up into the mountains? And you can often look at indigenous communities and see what their patterns were because they followed the bears. They were persecuted as much as the bears were. So a lot of times in Mexico, we see that our bear populations are up in the mountains. But bears are also grassland species. They come down and they follow acorns. We have oaks in the grasslands. So to paint a picture of where bears live, what their habitat preferences are based on this very young data set is a huge mistake. I wanted to talk a little bit about the indigenous people that live in northern Mexico and compare the difference between that and places like southern Mexico. And the one big factor that we have here that's very important for both indigenous communities and for bears or all wildlife is water. Northern Mexico is very arid, and what bears do in Montana or other places in the United States is not necessarily what they would do in an arid location like in northern Mexico. And if you want to see what bears do, just look at what the indigenous people used to do. And I'll tell that story in a minute, but I just wanted to show you here that this is the state of Durango. This is where my family is from, and this is my grandmother's side. On the right, you see the Zacatecos, the grass people, and on the left, up in the upper left-hand corner, the Tepehuanes, and they overlapped quite a bit. But again, they were neighbors, and they all shared the same commonality of looking for acorns. They also shared the same commonality of being massacred, of being captured to be put to work in the silver mines. They were assimilated into the Jesuit missions. So there's, what we call a Mexican is usually an indigenous person that has been assimilated. And there are very few, indigenous communities that are isolated and living, as they once did. The Tepehuanes are one of those communities. Unfortunately, the Zacatecos have been assimilated and there's not many of them left in their communities. So again, just overlapping, this right here is a picture of the side of a metal water tank, and you can see where the bears were trying to get in to get water. And I wanted to emphasize the importance of water and what that was going to mean for bears and for indigenous people in northern Mexico, and how both follow food. And that's really critical. And those are very long-term data sets that they have learned how to follow this food resource. And for bears, acorns are the top food item that they eat, and they depend on it. If they have a complete mast failure, their whole population declines. They don't reproduce. The cubs die. There's a lot of social dynamics going on. So acorn production is very important. And that's why I say the acorn is even stronger than the bear, because if the acorn doesn't produce, the bears don't either. All right, so here you see this is a Mexican black bear, or American black bear in Mexico, but I call them Mexican black bears. And again, their primary food source is acorns. We have 12 different species of acorns in this part of the country where I work. And if one species isn't producing, generally they'll take turns and alternate years. So there's always something that bears can eat. However, I want to point out how climate change has changed that. We've experienced some massive wildfires there, massive drought. We were in the middle of what we call a mega drought. And we are seeing complete mass failure now. And now a lot of the bears are moving into urban areas, into cities, looking for garbage. We're seeing the same thing in Montana. It's these food failures that are causing these bears to move around these landscapes. So keep that in mind. There's a reason behind that. It's not just because people leave their trash out, but it's also things that are happening on their landscapes. So one of the other things that I wanted to point out was in Mexico, based on the Starker-Leopold map, I don't know where this came from, but in the publications, somebody estimated that bear populations had declined by 80%. And I don't know where that came from, but yet because it's published, everybody takes that as gospel. I want to talk to you a little bit about publications. Publications in the science literature came from the Royal Society of England way back in the 1600s, and they kind of were involved with the era of discovery and going out and studying everything on the planet, bringing back their knowledge and publishing. That was their mile marker, and that's how they, got their prestige. That's how they were ranked in their society. I should mention, nothing offensive, nothing, not to offend our white male colleagues, but they were all white males that did this. And so basically they made all the decisions in terms of how we looked at science and how we measured things in science. So that actually came over to the United States when the United States was colonized, and that system of merit is still here. With Indigenous communities, it's not so much. Indigenous communities protect their information. It's culturally sensitive. They don't necessarily publish all of their stuff for everybody to know. So that's really important for us to understand that as we work with Indigenous people and consider the respect for their communities. The same thing in Mexico, the Tepehuanes, the Zacatecos, they don't necessarily want people studying them and then going and publishing to the rest of the world to tell everybody what they're like. So that's a really important thing that's come about with, as traditional ecological knowledge is now elevated in importance with our societies, we need to be respectful. However, when we talk about these numbers, federal policy is now based on those estimates, even though those estimates are full of problems. But because it was published, that's what they're going with. So they're making these estimates that black bears are endangered in certain areas, that the populations are better in certain areas where we really don't know. And I will tell you this, bears are very, very difficult to count. We don't have any knowledge of previous numbers of black bears and where they liked to live. However, now we're seeing black bears expand in Mexico, and they're moving back into what we think is their historic ranges. We have camera trap images of black bears with howler monkeys. And so they're now even pushing down into the jungle areas. Did they live there before? We don't really know. But yet we make these estimates of, Yogi Bear, those kinds of things of where bears live. We need to let them tell us where they want to live and where they want to go now that their numbers are returning. So we don't have any quantitative evidence of those numbers. And once it's in the literature, it's really hard to stop. So that's been a problem that we've had based on how this influences policy and everything else. Where I landed for a number of reasons was in an area just about 150 kilometers southeast of Big Bend National Park. It's the Serranías del Burro in Coahuila. This is all part of my family's ancestral home range. And I ended up in a place that were, formerly Spanish land grants and then converted into cattle ranches. And I ended up with a group of cattle ranchers. There's about 30 families there. And they decided to put their efforts together to create a big conservation area. And one thing I will say about these ranchers is that They were very conscientious about conservation. And a lot of what we've learned in Mexico about conservation and good practices to coexist with things like bears and other predators have come from this area. And since then, other models have been established. So regardless of Mexico's past history, you know, my history is mixed as well. So these people invited me to come and study black bears and see how this could be applied to conservation as a whole. Here it is right there. And this is part of the big oak area. All of these areas in the mountains and even with the grasslands. And I'm going with my little cursor here. This is the Sierra Madre Occidental. And then over here is the Sierra Madre Oriental. Okay. And my area was right here where I was focusing on the bear study. All right. And I was down there from 1991 to 2003, but I've continued to make observations and so forth, even though I'm not down there literally trapping bears to do the studies. And you can see it's quite an expansive area. It's one of the lowest human densities that we have in Mexico, but I think it's also one of the lowest human densities that we have in all of North America. It's fewer than one human being per 100 square kilometers. So for somebody like me who came along and wanted to study these bears, no roads, no anything, you can imagine, I really felt very privileged to be there and to get to know these animals and these people at the same time. And again, I want to emphasize how unusual and how different these people were that lived there. One of the groups of people that I met were actually, they have a very interesting history, and they're the Mascogos, or the Black Seminoles, that were pushed out of Florida when the U.S. took over Florida, and they were moved out. A lot of them were escaped slaves that went to Florida because Spain didn't believe in slavery. And so they, well, they didn't officially practice it, although they did it. And so a lot of these escaped slaves actually mixed and coexisted with the Seminoles that were in Florida at that time. When they had to leave Florida, there was a group of them that ended up, it's a long story. If you want to know more, I can give you some really good literature. But long story short, they ended up in Mexico, where the president of Mexico gave them their own land because they were helping to keep their enemies, who were the Comanches at the time, to keep them from raiding in these large haciendas and so forth in northern Mexico. So these Black Seminoles stayed there. They've been there for over 150 years. And they ended up being all of the cowboys, and the people that worked on the ranch became some of my closest friends. And really, what I learned from them is, even though they didn't have the traditional ecological knowledge that was lost by the eradication of all of the tribes that were there before, these people had been there long enough to acquire local knowledge. And so they knew a lot about the black bears and had been living with them for quite a while and passing down those stories. So what's interesting is that when I got there, you know, here comes this young woman who's educated, and she's going to do this black bear study. And I was meeting with all of these people, and I remember sitting down with the cowboys and the ranchers and giving them this list of, or they gave me a list. They told me everything that they knew about black bears. They told me, you know, what the females ate, where they went, what they did with the males, how many cubs they had every year, where they went during drought, you know, what they ate at this time of year, what they were doing when they were concentrated. And this list was pretty comprehensive. And long story short is that I spent almost $1 million on this project to pretty much check off everything off that list. And so after I was done with all of this intensive study, you know, spending, you know, exhausting how much carbon, putting carbon in the air with telemetry flights, and not only that, harassing these animals and putting collars on them and everything else, when these people already had it all figured out. So I'm a little bit embarrassed because of that, but I also use this to teach and say, look, you know, when people tell you about their local knowledge and people tell you about their traditional ecological knowledge, you want TEK or ITEC, Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge about bears, just talk to some of our Salish and Kootenai colleagues. They've been living with bears for a long time, and they know a lot about bears. And it's a shame that we don't visit and talk to people and learn what they already know without having to spend ridiculous amounts of money just so that we can publish. All right, so there I go, right? Capturing bears. I caught over 100 bears. And again, this looks really cute. And I remember at a conference, and all of the young women were so impressed that I was crawling into bear dens and pulling out these cubs. But now that I look at it and I think about what that meant for females and pulling their cubs out and harassing them, and the potential for losing a female when you put her under with anesthesia, I thought, you know, especially after comparing to that list, it's bothered me for a long time. It was an incredible experience, and we found some information that was useful, but for the most part, had I just listened to those folks, maybe I could have just lived there and become a cowboy or something and not spent all that money, but then I wouldn't get a PhD either. So it's a very twisted, hypocritical, dual, you know, I guess, mind games that we play with this kind of stuff. But I thought it was important to tell my story. This is Miguel, and Miguel is a Seminole, a Muskogee, and Miguel accompanied with me to all of my den work, and these are the people that I worked with on a daily basis. Had incredible friendships and learned incredible knowledge from them. And so I'm not sad about the experience that I had, but I do have my regrets, I think, in how we did this. So to present the Western side of the data to you, this is the first period that I had from 91 to 94. Now, I want to mention that during this time, it was very, very, good rainfall. Everybody was happy. Bears are solitary. They do not like to share with other bears. Male bears kill the females and they kill the cubs. So bears spend a lot of their time spreading themselves out across these landscapes to protect themselves. And when there's a lot of food, everybody's great. We had really high reproductive rates, 4 cubs per female. Guess what? The cowboys had already told me that. We had very high survival rates. 80% of our cubs survived during good years. Very high and increasing density of bears. We had a lot of females. And again, this was during normal rainfall. However, what was really interesting, and this is something that I think I was able to pull out of this study, but had I had access to the traditional ecological knowledge, I'm pretty sure that my ancestors could have told me that they already had this figured out. In 1998 to 2001, we hit a severe drought and we had a complete mast failure. We had increase in mortality in females. Males were coming in and killing the females because they were all concentrated in these food patches trying to get food and water. 80% of our cubs were killed. We had all these really weird, you'd go to like a water tank where there were some oak trees and we'd have like 14 or 15 bears trying to get water at the same time. Very low reproductive rates and a very high increase in human bear conflict. A lot of the bears started killing cattle, getting into houses and having all kinds of problems. So it's kind of like looking at things through a magnifying glass. In the literature, this was what I was depending on. And I'm not really sure that the cowboys or the Muskogees could have told me this, but maybe my ancestors could have. But what ended up happening was in the literature, for example, in Montana and other places that had homogeneous habitats where we had more of an equal food distribution, females normally didn't leave their natal ranges. They had no reason to do that. If you had food, a female's not going to travel very far at the risk of her cubs. However, in this mountain range, when the food failures took place, we started noticing that females started leaving their natal ranges. They were dying in the desert. Some of them were making it to Texas, but at a high risk. And so that was really interesting that they did indeed leave their natal ranges, and we call it threshold of misery. It says, how miserable do you have to be before you leave? And you can see what's happening along our southern border right now. You're seeing that with human beings, that when there's a lot of misery, people make that leap, that risk to migrate to somewhere different, just in the hopes of finding something better. And that happens with bears. And this is the area between the Serranías del Burro and Big Bend National Park. Temperatures can get up to 125 degrees during the summertime. There were other researchers in Texas at the time because some of our bears started coming over to Big Bend in the 1980s, and they have actually repopulated some of the areas in Texas. But they had some bears radio collared and found that they did indeed die in the desert of dehydration and just the heat in and of itself. And it was a female with cubs. So we know that it's happening. So what was going on is I was having a difficult time really figuring out what was going on because I was basing everything on what I knew in the literature and it just didn't fit. And I was seeing really weird things. And I started realizing that my little toolbox that they sent me to Mexico with was not working very well. It wasn't helping me answer the questions. We had radio collared all of these animals, but at the same time, we weren't really watching them migrate to Big Bend or anywhere else because we had thousands of bears and I only caught 100. It was a very small sample size. So those tools just really weren't big enough to help tell the stories of what was going on there. In reality, knowing what I know now, I'm 62 years old. Okay, I started this work when I was about 20. And knowing what I know now and having observed and having talked to a lot of people and shared information with other colleagues, this is not necessarily quantified in the literature, but we do know that these bears emigrate between these mountain ranges looking for food. And when they do that, and where I live now in the Texas Hill Country, some of you will be coming to Junction. This used to be incredible bear habitat. And now what's happening is as these bears disperse from Mexico and other places, maybe during a drought or a wildfire looking for food, maybe they find a place in the Texas Hill Country and it's like, you know what, this place isn't bad, I'm going to stay here. So this is actually a mechanism on how bears can inhabit their historic ranges, is through this type of immigration. And it's not, we look at drought and we look at wildfire and so forth, but this has been happening for thousands and thousands of years, and it's actually a mechanism that helps drive these bear populations to re-expand into new areas. Who knows what we're going to see with climate change, and who knows what we're going to see, because now bears have access to human foods, to garbage, to crops, to all kinds of things. And one of the big things that we have here in southern Texas and northern Mexico are deer feeders. Hunting is a really big industry here, and on average in Texas, we have a deer feeder per square quarter mile. That's a lot of food, and bears get into these deer feeders, they get shot. It's causing all kinds of chaos. So to get an idea of what happened naturally and what we're seeing now with climate change and all of these other influences from humans, it's getting very interesting. So one of the things that we are finding is the relevance of water. Here's a female at one of the springs that we have in Mexico, and without water, they can't survive. So right now we're in this mega drought in northern Mexico and in Texas, pretty much all of it. And we are drying up. The rivers here have dried up for the first time that most people here can remember. Animals aren't finding their water. They're having to go look for it. And for example, in the city of Monterey, where my family now lives, just south of Laredo, Texas, that's a city of 7 million people. Bears are moving into the city because of swimming pools and water. They're looking for water. So water has now become an attractant that we have to think about, that's drawing bears into problem areas. One of the things that I wanted to do was to understand these bear foods, and they're really difficult to quantify across the landscape, especially in northern Mexico. We have super diverse food items. We have, bears can always find something to eat. Even during drought, we have things like prickly pear fruits. We have the flowers on the yuccas. They actually eat the yuccas themselves. We have madrone berries, choke cherries. They eat insects, and of course, acorns being about 80% of their diet. So it's really hard to quantify that for me to measure, like how that's going to influence their growth patterns across each season. So I had a very clever advisor that helped me to identify how we could possibly answer this. And this is when I started shifting from spending all of my time trapping bears and following bears. Instead, I started following their food, and I actually learned more about them by doing that. So again, acorns being the most important thing. And you saw in my little video that I was sitting at a water tank one day and an acorn dropped in my lap. I was watching these bears fight over water. A female that we had, she got killed with her cubs right there. And I was trying to figure out what in the world is going on. And I realized how this food was driving these populations, and got to work at, doing lots of vegetation transects and trying to measure food production. So this is where it gets really interesting. And for those of you who are, wanting to go into geospatial sciences and things like that, this is exactly the kind of tool that we use that I really got excited about. And this was a tool that we could really identify some of the bigger picture things that were going on here. And this is a great part of STEM, I think, that's combining well with indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And in this case, this is 100 square kilometers. And what I did, I probably needed a, lifetime friendship with a chiropractor, because all I did was go around and measure fruit production and acorn production across a 100 square mile landscape, and ended up developing a map to combine all of these different food items. I had to take them into the lab, measure their digestible energy, how many calories were in an acorn, and then I combined it with what I was seeing on the landscape and produced a calorie map. All right. So these are all of the fall foods, and I combined all of those different foods based on their calories. And you can see here that for the most part, except for this side of the ranch that was a little bit drier, but for the most part, if a bear was looking for calories, they were pretty much going to find it sometime during the fall. And you can imagine that these bear populations were spread out, where everybody was happy and not bothering each other, right? So this is during a good rain year. The next year we went into our drought, and guess what happened? Everything dried up. We had just 3 patches that produced calories that year, And the patch on the right is the one that I was sitting at under the tree when I saw 14 bears coming in to try to get water and to defend their space under the oak trees. And this is where we had one of our females and her cubs killed and completely devoured. And it just clicked with me. And I just thought, oh my gosh, this is what's going on with food production. It's causing all of these dynamics to happen with these bear populations, causing them to concentrate. And at what point does a female say, you know what, I cannot handle this. I got to get some food. I got to leave. And what we did notice was that they did expand their home ranges that doubled during this time. And I'm sure we didn't catch a lot of those females that were actually moving over to different mountain ranges or moving north to Texas. So what we noticed that during these periods, and we call them weather-related stochastic events, where you have a stochastic event that comes in like a wildfire or a massive drought. It's a very significant impact that affects your entire population. It's not going to just affect a few bears, but this is weather-related events that affect everybody. We noticed that there was an increase in patchiness in food production. The local densities of bears increased, which really messes you up if you're trying to get bear density estimates to manage populations and you're looking in an arid area. Some of them are concentrated and then you have 20 miles of nothing. And what we do as scientists is we generally take samples and then we extrapolate it across a landscape. This makes that very difficult to do. There was an increased probability of encounter with other bears, really high stress and aggression. I know that with elephants during drought, they've actually sampled and found that their cortisol levels increase. They go through the roof, and I'm pretty much assuming that the same thing goes on with bears, that their stress and aggression increases. We had them breaking into homes. We had them killing each other, killing cattle. This poor female is trying to raise her yearling cubs, and you can just see how skinny she is, and she's just trying to look for whatever food she can. And at what point to protect her cubs does she make a run for it? And thus the increased search areas. They start expanding their home range, and they're thinking, all right, let's just go for it. Again, increased conflict between bears. And then we had direct and indirect mortality on bears. Some bears were starving directly because there was no food, but then because of the increased patchiness and these concentrations, male bears were killing these bears. So they were getting it from all sides. And this is really important to know, particularly related to climate change, how this might impact bear populations as a whole, because it's not just direct mortality, it's also going to be indirect as well. All right, so that helped us to understand a little bit better about the relevance of these stochastic events, but with climate change, we're now seeing it at a much, much higher level. And what is that going to mean, not just for bears, but for humans and for many other animals as well? So again, I want to talk a little bit about the local knowledge. This is Felipe Pineda, which is one of my husband's best friends. And Felipe was one of the people that really started contributing information about what he saw going on with the bears, because he was out there all the time. And he was telling me, you know, what's going on with bear predation and how they were impacting, you know, how we're making it more vulnerable to for bears to prey on cattle. So I learned a lot about that. We actually did a study to look at whether bear predation increases in brushy areas versus open areas, because cows can see very well. And sure enough, he was right. 75% of the kills happened in closed areas, and also was correlated with the proximity to water. So we just told the ranchers, you know what, when you have your cows with your calves, keep them in open areas. Might want to put a cowboy out there at night for the first month, but also make sure that you keep your other watering areas open to keep everybody from funneling into the same place. At one cattle herd one night, I counted 9 bears circling the cattle herd. It was like sharks out there because they know where to get their food. We had catastrophic fires in 2011. It burned almost 1 million acres. And at that point, you can see here on the right, what in the world are they going to eat? And so that got us to addressing things like burn severity maps, looking at the impact of what that would mean to acorn production over time. Here you can see the comparison of before and after. And all of a sudden, we started noticing a lot of reports of bears coming into Texas because of these fire events, and started clicking with us of how these stochastic events impact bears. You can see here, These are all just observations, whereas Texas, remember, they didn't have any black bears before. And the year after the fire, these are the reports that we got along the Texas border. We had bears living in towns that were eating cat food and feral cat colonies that people were feeding cats. All kinds of things were going on, but just an incredible increase, and many of those bears that they observed were female. So you can see here this whole driving mechanism that's caused by bears simply looking for food. So one of the really great things as I started looking into this more and looking back at, remembering a lot of the things that my grandfather taught me, was really, how the power of an acorn was impacting these things at large landscape scales, and having to deal with the struggle of publishing this material. I didn't want to publish this material. The ranchers didn't want me to publish it, and I didn't feel comfortable doing it. But at the same time, it wasn't even quantifiable. How could I quantify what was happening on these large landscapes? So I made the big decision not to do that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, comparing our types of sciences. But science, no matter how you look at it, is a matter of watching and listening and observing and recording. And then you go back and you rewatch and you re-observe and you relearn and you re-record. And that's how this traditional ecological knowledge is passed down over thousands of years. And I can tell you that my ancestors here on the right knew probably everything there was to know about acorns. They probably knew every species. They knew when they produced. They knew what drought did to acorn production. They knew what fire did to acorn production, and what kind of information I could have utilized for applying towards bear conservation just with their knowledge alone. It was very difficult for me to access that information. They don't trust people. They're very, very remote, very just very low contact. And I wanted to be really careful about that. I was not raised traditionally with the Tepehuanes, and so I don't want to just go in there and saying, hey, I'm Tepehuan, I really need to, there's a whole different story to that, but I wanted to be respectful of that. But at the same time, I realized what a loss that I had had because I did not have access to that long-term data set and their knowledge and their familiarity with these acorns. So when we do talk about indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, basically it's people that have lived on those landscapes for long periods of time, and they become intimate with both the animals, the plants, everything that's there, because they have relationships with these things. Very contrary to STEM type sciences, Western sciences that tell us to be objective. We're not supposed to attach ourselves, but we very well recognize, hey, we are part of this system. We live here with all of our relatives, and the loss that we've had because we do not connect with that, or we do not respect it enough, is tremendous. And I love to see the fact that that's changing now. We have a really wonderful Indigenous Research Center at SKC now, where we're starting to stand up for ourselves and talk about what the boundaries are of how this science can be used, how it needs to be respected, and so forth, especially since there's a big run on it since, the White House has issued these memos on how traditional ecological knowledge needs to be considered for any of our policy decisions. Considered is very different than used. So people don't just get to go in and use this material without going to the people that are these knowledge keepers and incorporating them and bringing us to the table for our input. So again, Western science often asks us to dissect and ask at very small levels. Remember, we talked a little bit about what was going on with bears before, the Spaniards arrived. So it's a very small picture of time that we have for bears in Mexico, and we know very, very little. And some questions are just way too big to dissect without considering the intricate puzzle pieces that go along with that and all these relationships that were there before. And again, we're just looking at a very, very small photo in terms of what we see on these landscapes. And in reality, they're much, much bigger than the tiny pictures that we see in our publications or since the time that people have settled this continent. So one of the keys that I did the conclusion that I came to was that working closely with my local communities not only empowered those communities to be part of the science process, but in reality they contributed more to conservation than any of my Western science products that I came out of with this project. I could have done just fine without learning some of this stuff by just acquiring that information by talking to people and living there. Living there was one of the best experiences that I had because I saw these animals every day and I learned from them every day. And I think that, one thing that's important to know is that traditional ecological knowledge provides us with a foundation for how food and water, drive these systems. Fortunately, I was able to put that together, but there was a lot of revelation and a lot of, looking back to my ancestors to figure out how that happened. If I had relied solely on Western science, I don't think we would have come up with half of what we learned to apply towards conservation. And I will say that bears are now expanding and recovering in Mexico. And then the local knowledge helped to fill in the gaps that helped me to lead to the path for bear recovery. That local knowledge was very important. And again, our quantitative data were relatively weak, and it wasn't completely worthless, but I wouldn't do it again. Let me put it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up to questions. I want to introduce you to this bear. His name was Buji. That's the name for bear in Tepehuán or Nahuatl, or that language for the Tepehuanes. And he just got done eating a deer, and you can see the hairs on his face. I love this bear. He's just beautiful. Anyway, I just want to open it up to questions that you might have, whether it's about bears or what you want to do with your career path. I will say this to encourage you in your career path. It's not just one path. All right. If you are Indigenous, I encourage you to pursue another path. Even if you're not Indigenous, you don't always have to follow the same template that they give you. You don't always have to use the same toolbox. I want to encourage you all to think outside the box, get creative. After I worked in academia for a long time and was a professor and blah, 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 I quit. I quit my job and I decided to start my own organization so I could answer the problems or answer the questions that I wanted to ask and solve problems, which is how I found my way to Salish Kootenai, where I'm addressing culture and place-based education that's fitted for those communities, and also just to really get back in touch with the animals that I love so much. So that's it in a nutshell. If somebody has career questions, I'd be happy to answer those as well.
Great. Well, thanks, Deanna. That was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate that you're offering to answer some questions from our students. I know a lot of our students are pretty early on in their academic careers and in life in general. So if anybody would like to type a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand or just unmute and ask a question, that would be great.
Okay, let's see. Okay, just got into my chat here.
I have a question.
Hi, Ren. Yes.
Yes, hello. I'm on screen I appear as Drew Grinnell, but actually my name is Danny. I'm one of the students.
Nice.
I was just curious for your calorie map showing before and after the drought. It kind of looked like of course it looked like a real high up view. I was just wondering if that was like satellite imagery or if you captured like multispectral imaging with like drones or something, or if you could just tell me about that.
We didn't have drones when I was way back then. We didn't even have GPS. So anyway, that was satellite imagery, same approaches that we used for doing vegetation maps, but we used calories instead. And so, yeah, we had to use it was actually quite complicated, but I'd be glad to send it to you. So we just got, the vegetation map, and then we had to look at what parts of the vegetation were oak. And then there was a lot of extrapolation going on in there. And yeah, it'd be easier for me to send it to you, but yeah, it was definitely satellite imagery. And I will say that there are a number of people, even up there in Glacier National Park and in those areas, that are doing some similar work, and the technology is a lot more advanced. But I think just in general, you just need to get a capture of how many calories you have across that landscape and how those calories are changing. There's some ground truthing to it, but I think over time you can get enough accuracy to where you can just rely on some of the satellite information. So did that answer your question, Danny?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, let's see here. I don't want to miss any of these questions. So let's see, such long legs. Oh, I didn't know you could see my legs, but I'm assuming you're talking about bears, right? So anyway, yeah, they do have long legs, but only when they're that skinny. They look like little water balloons when they're fat. And I will say that they ranged. I had females I would catch in the summer and weighed 100 pounds. And when I checked them in the den, they weighed 300 pounds. So that's how much they put on before they go in the den and have to keep that much fat on them to keep their cubs alive. Somebody wanted to know how I got my funding. That's a really great question. So normally for our funding, we have this big research machine, and a lot of us are part of it. It's at, Western institutions and through federal governments, and we tell them how many publications we've had, and then they give us a big chunk of money to go out and go study these things. Well, I didn't have that. I didn't have any publications underneath my belt. I didn't have the experience. I was just an undergraduate student, just graduated, starting my master's. So believe it or not, I bought a red dress, which you'll never see me in again. And I went to Washington, D.C., and I went and knocked on doors. And I just walked into people's offices. I had one guy give me $50,000 because he said he was so appalled that I showed up without an appointment. And I ended up garnering money that way. I had enough to start. And then once we started, we would get people that would come in and visit the ranch, and I would take them out to, look at what we were doing, and they were pretty impressed. So overall, by the end of the project, and I'm talking about 2 whole full study area or study periods, we raised almost $1 million. So you just have to get really creative, and depending on what kind of money you do want, some people are easier. A lot of philanthropic efforts right now are leading to funds that don't have as many strings attached. Some of the government funds that we do are very complicated, and they require a lot. They want you to publish a lot. But, I went in this with the understanding that we probably were not going to publish this information. And what we're doing now, working with the landowners and the people there, we're going to be writing a book, but it's going to be more of a story. And talking about Buji and talking about what bears do across these large landscapes. So anyway, and yes, it was very, very hard for us to watch our females get killed. It was pretty gory. It was pretty it was very stressful. You could tell everybody was stressed, and you could see the aggression in bears and stuff. So it was very interesting. Okay, so after quitting academia, well, because I did this bear study and everything else, I became very good at finding money. And I actually got hired in South Texas for a couple of institutes. I didn't stay very long, but I was hired as a development officer because I was quite adept at it. And now I've turned that around, and I'm just not afraid to do it. I just go find the funding. And the most important thing is that you're confident about what you're doing, and you show it off, and you say, look, we're doing a good project here. We're solving really interesting questions. And even with people that don't expect us to publish, because we are upfront with it, we're working on some really great projects at Salish Kootenai. And yeah, it's really a lot of it's confidence. So anyway, yeah, I sure wish I had a GPS unit. Was there any equipment I wish I would have had but didn't? We got lost a lot. And so a GPS unit would have been really nice. We actually had, in some cases, to make our own topo maps. So if that tells you how archaic this was. And I had to send my teams out with radio collars in their backpacks so that I could find them in case they got lost, because you saw how remote that was. So yeah, you're fortunate to have GPS units, but learn how to do mapping, because if your battery dies, you're sunk. So if there's one thing we should do to help with bears climate change understanding TEK, what would it be? I would learn from our Native colleagues. Bring our Native colleagues to the table front and center. And if you ever, get the opportunity, learn from what they're doing. And that's why I like hanging out at Salish Kootenai, because I'm a bear fanatic, obviously, but their grizzly bear programs are a lot less aggressive than non-tribal programs. They answer questions that need to be answered, but aren't just harassing bears just for the sake of harassing bears. And I think there's just a lot to learn from your Native colleagues. Don't be afraid to learn, but whatever you do, don't do it for motives that aren't honest, and then aren't for their benefit as well. I think that's something that everybody's pretty tired of. People using indigenous people and their knowledge for their own benefit. Does Mexico do any conservation efforts? Mexico is not going to hell in a handbasket, believe it or not. We are doing a fantastic job there. We have more bears than Texas will ever have, because the minute they cross the border, they get shot in Texas. We don't do that in Mexico. We coexist with bears very much. We have jaguars. We have protected areas. We're doing a lot of things there, but Mexico, similar to indigenous people, is very private and doesn't like being told what to do by other countries. So we're kind of nationalistic, but in a different way. So we don't join a lot of, international collaborations and stuff. Mexico's very private about what they have and very protective, and they don't, they share a border with the United States, and they've been bullied around for a long time. So Mexico's very protective about that. We're doing some really great things down there. Really, I'm really proud of my colleagues. So, Anything else? I think that's about it so far. Did I miss anybody?
I think we got everything in the chat.
Great.
If there's anybody else who'd like to ask a question, we're getting kind of close to the end of the hour, and I want to honor your time, Deanna. I do have a question. I know a lot of the students in our program are interested in connecting with people in academia and in industry. Would it be okay if our students reach out to you at some point if they think of other questions or?
Absolutely. And I do a lot of mentoring. You know, I mentor just enough to keep people from going off a cliff. But, you know, I'll just be honest with a lot of students and just tell them, look, you know, you might want to consider this or you might not want to go down that pathway. I have a young Mexican student right now who's living in Europe, and somebody offered her a PhD in Norway. And I just told her, you know, these are things that you need to consider. If you're going to come back home, please learn in a place that's familiar with where you live and your culture, that's respectful of your culture. And so she's trying to get back. But those are the kind of you know, tips that I give people. I'm not able to take students because I'm not in that kind of a position. I'm not a professor anymore. But yeah, I'm always open to helping students and connecting people and that sort of thing.
Great. And what would be the best way for people to reach out to you?
Google me, sadly. You can just,
Okay.
my email is Diana, or I say Diana. I'm Diana in the United States, Diana in Mexico, but it's DIANA at animopartnership.org. So you can email me there. So, and never, ever, ever hesitate to reach out. You might have people that aren't friendly to help you there, but look, one of the reasons that I made it as far as I did is because I wasn't afraid to ask for help. I wasn't afraid to ask questions. I had confidence in what I was doing, and I was able to convince other people of that. So just don't be afraid. And if you are afraid, do it afraid. All right, just keep moving forward.
Great. Well, Deanna, I see some compliments in the chat there as well, but I just want to say a huge thank you for being part of our Nationwide Eclipse Ballooning Project speaker series. I learned a lot. I took a lot of notes. I love that you were able to reflect back on your own career and even share some of your regrets and vulnerabilities. I don't think people always do that, so I sure appreciated that, and some great advice for our students as well. Oh, somebody has asked if you could drop your email in the chat. Would
I
you
just did.
be comfortable doing that?
I just
Awesome.
threw it in there. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the things I want to say before we go is that no matter who you connect with, no matter where you work, be respectful of the people that live there, be respectful of the people that used to live there. And no matter what you do in research, no matter what you do in science, be respectful of the people. Don't just go in there to publish. You know, that is a disease that we have in science that is just, it's worse than smallpox. It's really, really hard to contain, that people see science as the entail, and it's not. You know, you don't get permission to use people or to go in and use people's cultures or their land or their animals even. And that's how I felt about the bears. You know, we don't have permission to do that. So just, I would love to see a new generation of young people that are respectful of that. That would be a huge accomplishment for those of us who have been doing this for so long.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Thanks to all of our students and other folks who joined us today. We do have our speaker series going on all throughout the spring. We have some great speakers, I think, pretty much every week up through the end of March. So we will be sharing the registration information with everybody on the team and hope to see you all again here online in the very near future.
Safe travels, everybody, on your way to the eclipse. I'm excited to meet some of you. So take care.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.